Yet, there they were, holding one of the most coveted lottery tickets in sports history. On June 17, 1986, according to NBA Draft Archive records, Boston selected Len Bias with the second overall pick. The room erupted. Bias walked across the stage, shook hands, and instantly became the face of the next generation. Television coverage at the time focused heavily on the sheer disbelief of the situation. Pundits and reporters noted how unprecedented it was for a championship roster to simply absorb the most explosive college player in America. The tension was palpable in the room, as opposing executives whispered among themselves, realizing their own championship windows might be slamming shut for another 10 years. Why did the rich just get richer, and how did a team at the absolute peak of its power maneuver its way into the front of the draft line? Bias slipped on that green Celtics cap, flashing a smile that promised a decade of dominance. But the seeds of this exact moment had actually been planted in a quiet front office maneuver 2 years earlier. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe now, because what happened next began with one of the smartest front office moves in basketball history. To understand how Len Bias ended up wearing Celtics green, you have to look away from the flashing cameras and step into the smoky, quiet back rooms of the Boston front office. Red Auerbach was a mastermind of roster construction. He knew that his legendary front court of Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish was currently dominating the league. But he also understood the brutal toll that professional basketball takes on aging bodies. Red was not just managing the current season, he was obsessively planning for the 1990s. The execution of this plan required immense patience. According to major sports media transaction logs from October 1984, Red Auerbach traded starting guard Gerald Henderson and cash considerations to the Seattle Supersonics in exchange for their 1986 first-round pick. It was a gamble that paid off massively when Seattle struggled, turning that asset into the second overall selection. In the memoirs of former Celtics staff, it was revealed that in the spring of 1986, Auerbach reportedly turned down multiple massive trade offers for the pick, holding out specifically for Bias. Reporters noted at the time that Red rarely showed his hand, but he was unusually open about his infatuation with the kid from Maryland. But why was a notoriously tight-lipped executive so desperate to keep this specific draft pick when he could have traded it for established veteran help? The answer was not just about blind potential. It was about the undeniable, terrifying physical reality of what Bias was doing on the floor. The Boston front office knew they had secured their long-term future, but they had no idea just how lethal the young prospect's sheer athleticism had become down in College Park. Len Bias did not arrive at the University of Maryland as a finished product. Under the guidance of legendary head coach Lefty Driesell, Bias evolved from a raw, lanky freshman into a 210-pound force of nature. If you watched him play in the Atlantic Coast Conference, you saw a forward who could literally jump out of the gym, armed with a lethal mid-range jumper and an explosive baseline game that punished defenders. He played with a confident swagger that commanded respect every time his sneakers touched the hardwood. The numbers backed up the eye test. According to collegiate basketball archives, spanning from 1984 to 1986, he dominated the competition to win back-to-back ACC Player of the Year awards. His progression was steady and undeniable. According to university athletic records, during the 1985 to 86 season, his senior year, he averaged a career-high 23.2 points per game. He was not just outplaying his opponents, he was physically overwhelming them in a conference known for producing the best talent in the country. According to basketball archives, scouts and rival coaches were openly placing him on the exact same tier as Michael Jordan. It was a comparison that carried immense weight and set unimaginable expectations. But how do you handle being told you are the next Jordan before you even play a single professional minute? That kind of pressure changes a young man's reality, shifting the story from simple collegiate athletics to serious high-stakes business overnight. Bias had not just conquered the college game, he had conquered the business of basketball, and just hours after he walked off that draft stage, a corporate giant was waiting in a boardroom to hand him a $1.6 million fortune. When the television cameras finally stopped flashing in New York, the real business of basketball began. Bias was immediately flown out to Massachusetts for an introductory tour of the Boston Garden, walking the legendary parquet floor where he was expected to hang championship banners for the next decade. He met the local press, held up his crisp green jersey, and said all the right things with that signature, quiet confidence. But while the fans were focused on the sport, his representatives were quietly finalizing a deal that would secure his family's future for generations. According to press conference transcripts and financial reports from the afternoon of June 18, 1986, Bias sat down in a corporate boardroom and signed a 5-year shoe endorsement contract worth a reported $1.6 million. Reebok had targeted him as their crown jewel, positioning him to be the centerpiece of a massive marketing campaign designed to go head-to-head with Nike and their young star in Chicago. For a kid who had grown up in the working-class neighborhoods of Maryland, putting his name on that dotted line was a breathtaking moment of relief. The financial struggle was officially over. Reporters noted at the time how grounded he seemed during the negotiations, smiling constantly and talking about what this meant for his parents. The exhausting pressure of the collegiate spotlight and the draft gauntlet had finally lifted. According to published flight itineraries and media reports, he boarded a plane that same evening, flying back to Washington National Airport and touching down right around 10:30 at night. With his childhood dream realized and a life-changing contract in his pocket, he was heading back to his college campus to celebrate the ultimate victory, stepping into a late-night Maryland scene where the normal rules of life no longer seemed to apply. When Bias arrived back in College Park, the atmosphere on campus was electric. He was the local hero who had conquered the basketball world and come home to share the glory. Everywhere he went, he was surrounded by admirers, old friends, and the inevitable hangers-on who always managed to orbit a newly minted millionaire. He was riding the absolute highest emotional wave a 22-year-old could possibly experience. According to public motor vehicle records cited heavily in news reports at the time, Bias was cruising the dark campus streets in a brand-new, leased Nissan 300ZX sports car. He was out on the town, visiting off-campus gatherings, eating crabs with his closest friends, and soaking in the admiration of his peers. For a few hours, the story was nothing but a beautiful culmination of hard work. He was untouchable, moving through the humid Maryland night like royalty. But the timeline of that evening quickly began to stretch into the dangerous hours of the morning. The celebration did not wind down when the off-campus parties ended. According to timeline reconstructions detailed in subsequent police reports, he returned briefly to his dorm room right around 2 o'clock in the morning on June 19th, only to turn around and head right back out into the night to meet up with others. He finally walked back into his suite at Washington Hall as the sky was just starting to lighten, accompanied by a longtime friend who was reportedly carrying a small plastic bag that would permanently alter the history of American sports. Inside Washington Hall, the celebratory mood shifted into a private gathering. The suite was small and cramped, completely typical for college athletes who usually spent their early mornings catching up on sleep or preparing for morning workouts. Present in the room were a few familiar faces. His teammates Terry Long and David Gregg, along with his longtime friend Brian Tribble. For a moment, it was just young men talking about the future, the money, and the Celtics. But the nature of the celebration soon took a tragic turn. According to court records and grand jury testimonies that would later become highly publicized, the men in that room spent the early morning hours, roughly between 3 and 6 o'clock, consuming what was reported to be a highly concentrated illicit substance. The narrative around this specific moment has always been fiercely debated. as some reports claimed he might have been a casual user hiding a habit, while friends and family adamantly defended his clean, church-going reputation, suggesting this was a tragic first-time mistake made under the intoxicating illusion of invincibility. Whatever his prior history might have been, the physical reaction that morning was devastating. According to emergency dispatch logs, the quiet atmosphere violently shattered sometime between 6:25 and 6:32 in the morning, when the indestructible athlete suddenly collapsed. His heart gave out, and he began suffering a severe, uncontrollable physical crisis right there on the dorm room floor. Panic instantly tore through the tiny room as his friends desperately tried to revive him, culminating in a frantic, terrifying phone call that still chills anyone who listens to it today. A 210-pound elite athlete, widely considered to be in the absolute peak of physical condition, does not simply collapse without warning. But as the sun began to rise over the Maryland campus, the celebration inside that cramped suite had devolved into a full-scale medical emergency. His friends watched in horror as his heart suddenly gave out, leaving the invincible forward completely unresponsive on the floor. In audio recordings released by the county, the frantic desperation of that morning remains deeply unsettling. At exactly 6:32 in the morning on June 19, 1986, Brian Tribble placed a 911 call requesting immediate medical assistance. You can hear the urgency as he tries to convey the gravity of the situation to a confused dispatcher, repeatedly stating the name of the fallen star to impress upon them that this was not a standard campus incident. But why did a group of young men wait until the situation was catastrophic before calling for help? And what exactly had happened in the chaotic moments just before the line connected? While his teammates reportedly attempted failed resuscitation efforts, the clock was relentlessly ticking against a body that just a day earlier had been insured for over $1 million. According to official emergency medical technician dispatch records, Prince George's County paramedics arrived at Washington Hall at precisely 6:40 in the morning. They found an overwhelming scene. The medical personnel immediately took over, rushing his massive, motionless frame down the narrow dormitory stairs. The ambulance tore through the campus streets with its sirens blaring, racing toward the emergency room at Leland Memorial Hospital to begin a medical battle that was already lost. When the paramedics wheeled him through the hospital doors, the medical staff immediately recognized the face of the young man they were trying to save. He was given the absolute highest level of emergency cardiovascular care available. Doctors and nurses worked furiously to restart his heart, using every chemical and electrical intervention at their disposal. The contrast was devastating. Less than 48 hours prior, he was standing in a tailored suit in New York, shaking hands with the commissioner of the NBA. Despite the exhaustive efforts of the medical team, the physical damage was irreversible. According to the official hospital press release, Len Bias was formally pronounced deceased at 8:55 in the morning on June 19, 1986. The front office of the Boston Celtics, a legendary organization that had just drafted him to carry their franchise into the next decade, received the devastating phone call shortly after. A dynasty's future had been erased in a matter of hours. Television coverage at the time focused intensely on the stunned crowds gathering outside the brick building in Maryland. Students, local fans, and a rapidly expanding swarm of national media stood on the hospital lawns, completely paralyzed by the news. How could a player renowned for his unmatched stamina and clean-cut image be gone before ever playing a professional minute? The grief washed over the sports world immediately. According to major sports media reports, on June 23rd, over 11,000 devastated fans and colleagues attended his massive memorial service at the Cole Fieldhouse. But as the tears dried and the initial shock began to settle, the public mourning hardened into anger, demanding an explanation that would soon arrive in the form of a highly controversial autopsy report. The sudden loss of a generational talent demanded a clear scientific explanation. The public, the university, and the authorities needed to know exactly what had caused the strongest man in college basketball to suffer a catastrophic physical collapse. The investigation moved swiftly from the campus to the laboratory. In a televised press conference transcript from June 24, 1986, the Maryland chief medical examiner announced the official findings to a nationwide audience. The cause of the tragedy was severe intoxication from an illicit substance, which had violently interrupted the normal electrical signals of his heart. According to public medical examiner documents released later that summer, the toxicology report indicated absolutely no traces of alcohol or other substances in his system, revealing only a massive concentration of highly pure narcotics. The revelation was explosive. Why did that specific chemical reality surface right then, effectively erasing his carefully guarded, pristine public image overnight? The sports world immediately splintered into fierce debates. As some reports claimed, the lack of chronic tissue damage suggested this was a tragic, fatal first-time mistake made during a reckless celebration. By other accounts, whispered among unnamed campus sources, the narrative of a first-time user was a protective shield meant to preserve his legacy. Regardless of his prior history, the story took a painful turn as reporters completely abandoned his basketball statistics to dig into his private life. With the medical cause officially stamped on public documents, law enforcement immediately pivoted their attention from a rescue mission to a criminal grand jury indictment aimed squarely at the other men inside room 1103. When a tragedy of this magnitude strikes, the public demands accountability, and the local justice system is usually forced to deliver a target. With the medical examiner's report cementing the cause of the physical collapse, investigators zeroed in on the men who were in that dormitory suite. The state's attorney aggressively pursued the case, determined to make a very public example of the situation and find the person responsible for bringing the illicit materials onto the campus. According to public legal filings from July 1986, Brian Tribble was formally indicted on severe charges, including possession and distribution of the substances linked to the fatal incident. At the same time, teammates Terry Long and David Gregg found themselves at the center of serious allegations, facing charges for reportedly obstructing justice. Investigators suspected that the players had attempted to clean the room and hide evidence in the chaotic moments before making that frantic emergency call. However, those specific charges against the teammates were eventually dropped after they agreed to provide testimony for the prosecution. Reporters noted at the time that the ensuing trial turned the local courthouse into a relentless media circus. The prosecution painted Tribble as the primary supplier who facilitated the tragedy, while the defense argued heavily against the reliability of the state's witnesses. The legal battle stretched out for nearly a year, keeping the painful details of that morning in the national headlines. But despite the aggressive push by prosecutors, the courtroom did not deliver the decisive closure the public expected. According to television coverage at the time, in June 1987, a jury fully acquitted Tribble of the charges related to supplying the fatal dose. The state failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial ended without any major convictions, but the intense, glaring scrutiny of the investigation was already shifting its focus, aiming directly at the prestigious academic institution that was supposed to be protecting him. The University of Maryland likely hoped that the conclusion of the criminal trial would allow their campus to finally heal and move forward. Instead, the tragedy essentially blew the doors off their athletic department, exposing a broken system that had been hiding in plain sight. As investigators and journalists dug deeper into the player's life, the conversation shifted from the events of that single morning to the broader reality of how the university treated its star athletes. Court records and academic audits showed a stark contrast between his elite status on the basketball court and his quiet struggles in the classroom. According to university academic reviews published in the press in August 1986, it was revealed that he was 21 credits short of graduating and had failed 3 separate classes during his final spring semester. He was fundamentally failing as a student, yet the athletic machine kept him eligible and on the floor, exploiting his physical talents while neglecting his academic future. In interviews and public statements, faculty members began to openly revolt against the administration. The narrative was no longer just about a personal crisis, it was about an institutional failure. The pressure mounted heavily on the athletic director and the legendary head coach Lefty Driesell, who had built the program into a national powerhouse. The optics of a grieving, deeply embarrassed university simply could not sustain the status quo. According to official university statements released in October 1986, Coach Driesell was pressured into formally resigning from his position. The athletic director soon followed. The university paid an immense, lasting price in reputation and leadership, entirely dismantling the basketball program he had helped elevate. But while the academic scandals dominated the local Maryland papers, lawmakers in Washington were preparing to use his name to push through the most aggressive legislative package of the entire decade. By the fall of that year, the story had entirely left the realm of sports and entered the unforgiving, opportunistic machinery of federal politics. The mid-'80s were already defined by a rising national panic over narcotics, and the sudden loss of an all-American, universally loved athlete provided lawmakers with the ultimate symbol. They did not just mourn his passing, they weaponized it. Television coverage at the time focused intensely on politicians from both sides of the aisle rushing to the podium, using his drafted Celtics jersey and his tragic end as leverage to demand immediate, uncompromising action. The legislative response was blindingly fast. Congress rapidly drafted the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, a sweeping piece of legislation that became widely known in the press and the public as the Len Bias Law. According to public legislative documents, President Ronald Reagan officially signed the act into law on October 27, 1986. The legislation fundamentally altered the American justice system, introducing strict mandatory minimum sentences that remove discretion from local judges. According to federal sentencing guidelines archives from 1986 onwards, the law created a devastating 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between different forms of similar illicit substances. The intent, as claimed by lawmakers, was to look tough and eradicate the crisis that had reached into a college dormitory. But the reality was a deeply destructive policy that disproportionately impacted African-American communities for decades, locking away thousands of nonviolent offenders under the guise of protecting future athletes. His name was now permanently etched into draconian federal laws, but hundreds of miles to the north, the physical absence of his number 30 jersey was quietly beginning to tear the Boston Celtics apart. While politicians in Washington were busy rewriting the federal legal code, the Boston Celtics had to open their training camp in the fall of 1986. It was supposed to be a confident continuation of a championship run, but instead it felt like a somber gathering of aging veterans who suddenly realized they were entirely on their own. Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, and Robert Parrish were undeniably brilliant, but they were already accumulating the severe, painful physical mileage that comes with multiple deep playoff runs. The front office had drafted a spectacular 22-year-old powerhouse specifically to absorb those heavy rotational minutes, protect the veterans' bodies, and extend their careers into the next decade. Without that crucial infusion of youth and explosive energy, the legendary Boston roster was forced to grind through an absolutely brutal schedule. According to basketball archives, during the 1986-87 season, the battered Celtics pushed their aging bodies to the absolute limit, somehow fighting their way back to the NBA Finals. But the exhaustion was undeniable, and they ultimately lost the championship series to the Los Angeles Lakers in 6 games. Reporters noted at the time how physically shattered the Boston front court looked by June, playing on sheer will because their rotation simply lacked the athletic forward they had banked their entire organizational future on. The physical breakdown of that iconic roster was agonizing for the city to watch, but as the years went on, the franchise itself began to feel genuinely cursed. The front office eventually tried to rebuild the team's foundation, leaning on another young, dynamic, and beloved star named Reggie Lewis to take the mantle and lead the Celtics into the 1990s. But according to major sports media reports, the nightmare violently repeated itself in July 1993 when Lewis collapsed on the basketball court and passed away from a sudden, fatal cardiovascular condition. The Boston dynasty ultimately crumbled under the heavy weight of catastrophic physical injuries and devastating personal losses, leaving generations of fans forever haunted by the invisible ghost of a green number 30 jersey that never once saw the floor. When a basketball career is completely erased before a single professional minute is ever played, the legacy left behind is incredibly difficult to measure. Usually, as the decades pass, the hype surrounding a young, unproven athlete naturally fades away, easily replaced by the tangible statistics, highlight reels, and championship rings of the players who actually survived the professional grind. But in this specific, unique case, time has only amplified the legend. The stories of his unparalleled physical dominance have not quietly faded. They have become deeply ingrained in the permanent mythology of the sport. According to Hall of Fame press releases in the fall of 2021, he was posthumously inducted into the National Collegiate Basketball Hall of Fame. It was a formal, institutional acknowledgement that his time on the college hardwood was historically significant all on its own, regardless of what happened next. But the true measure of his lasting impact comes directly from the elite competitors of his era. In televised documentary interviews recorded over 30 years later, undisputed legends like Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson continually referenced his talent, speaking about him not as a tragic warning label,